We're here in Appleton, Wisconsin with Congressman Thomas Massie, one of the best scorers on the Freedom Index. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me here in Wisconsin.
So you've seen the Freedom Index before. We publish it in the New American Magazine, and we rank every member of Congress based on the constitutionality of their voting record. You obviously are one of the best in the entire Congress, so we thank you for that. And I'm wondering, what criteria do you use when you cast a vote on a particular bill? And how do you end up so high on the ranking?
Well, I've got a three-way test. Number one, is the bill constitutional? And that may be why I do so well on your scorecard, because if it's not constitutional, I'm not going to vote for it. But even if it's constitutional, can we afford it? Because if we can't afford it, if there's no money to pay for it, I can't vote for that either, right? So that would be another test that I apply. And then finally, is it better done at the state level, the federal level, or maybe it's better done at the school board or local level? If it's not a role of the federal government, then I won't vote for it either. Occasionally I have to throw in a fourth test, and that is, did I have time to read this bill? They'll give us a 2,000-page bill and expect us to vote on it 8 hours later. That will often garner a no for me, because how responsible would it be, or irresponsible, to vote for that bill if you haven't been able to read it?
Okay, very good. So I guess you vote no quite a bit then, huh?
I vote no 25% of the time.
Wow.
And that's earned me the nickname Mr. No. And I find that remarkable, that only 25% dissension with your party makes you an outcast. What they demand is 100% compliance. And of course I don't give it to them.
Wow, okay, very interesting. And has leadership given you any pushback for those dissenting votes?
Oh, of course, yes. I was removed as a subcommittee chairman early on in Congress. Now when they offer me a chairmanship of a subcommittee, I just politely decline it, because I know it'll be a few months until they'll ask to remove me again.
Oh, wow.
I've had my fundraising taken away. In other words, the leadership calls your biggest funders and says, look, if you ever want to be relevant in this city with the things that you care about, then you better quit giving money to Congressman Massie.
Wow. And
there's little things like that.
Wow. So is the relationship still a little bit rocky then? Or?
It's polite,
okay.
But everybody knows what the score is.
Okay. Huh. Very good. And you were one of the leading promoters of the AM exit,
yes.
And you co-sponsored a bill to get us out of the United Nations. I'm curious, why do you think we ought to leave the United Nations, and what exactly would that entail?
Yeah, the day after Brexit, on Facebook, I revived this bill that I'm a co-sponsor of to get us out of the United Nations, and I used the hashtag AmExit and UN exit. And both of those, and that post caught on pretty well, and it renewed interest in a bill that actually was introduced by Ron Paul many years ago, and a congressman before that. And the reason that I think we need to get out of the UN is, well, it's full of dictators, and it's also something that I don't think our sovereign government should defer to. For instance, a lot of these foreign relations bills that come in front of us in Congress, in the whereas clauses, they might say, whereas the UN has said this, or the UN decided this, now therefore be it resolved. Well, that's almost an automatic no for me, because why would I defer to the United Nations if we're a sovereign country? The best thing you can say about the United Nations is it's mostly ineffective and a waste of money. Like, that's the best thing you could say about it. So I'm glad that they're somewhat ineffective, but I don't like that we waste the money. We provide like 90% of the funding for the United Nations for their activities overseas, their intervention and whatnot. And so, the other countries who are in there, they don't pay their fair share, but a fair share would be zero, and we should get out.
Amen. So Trump has been kind of getting us out of some of these UN organizations. He announced we're leaving UNESCO. He said we're going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Most recently, the UN Compact on Migration, the UN Human Rights Council. What's the kind of sentiment in Congress? Are people in Congress okay with that, or is this kind of hesitant about what Trump is doing?
Of course, the deep state doesn't like that. They would like to see us fully involved in the United Nations and intervening in every country possible. One of the organizations that's actually worse than the United Nations is the World Trade Organization, because unlike the United Nations, which is mostly ineffective, the World Trade Organization has been effective at dictating the terms of our trade. And that's why Trump's push toward bilateral agreements over multilateral agreements is also good. You know, if you have a bilateral agreement, a trade agreement, and there's a dispute with the country that you're trading with, then you settle it. Two sovereign nations settle it. When you have a multilateral agreement, that requires a higher form of government, if you will, that other sovereign countries must defer to, and that's where the World Trade Organization comes into effect. And so, for instance, there are bills that are foisted upon us in Congress, and we're told, well, the World Trade Organization ruled, and you're going to have to vote for this bill. And a lot of my colleagues dutifully vote for that bill to keep us out of trouble with the World Trade Organization. I think that's a problem, and that's another area where, at least when he was campaigning, President Trump pushed back against, and to some degree still is, even though he's surrounded by the swamp, and they like those sort of arrangements.
Speaking of the deep state and the swamp, you kind of give us a handle for what it feels like to be in Washington, just totally surrounded by this. I mean, what kind of pressure do they exert? What kind of goals do they have, and how do they operate?
Well, their goal is to be as least accountable as possible. So when I was in business, we had a saying, never confuse activity with progress. In the swamp, they do a lot of activity and try to project it as progress. You know, and it's in fact not that. A lot of the functions that were in Congress have been abdicated to the executive branch or the judicial branch. So Congress is somewhat like an ombudsman to the executive branch now, where the institution itself is very impotent, but my colleagues like to go home and project that we aren't. When in fact they come to D.C. and vote to give that power back to the deep state. I call it the deep swamp. I've merged the two terms. You've got the deep state, you've got the swamp, so it's the deep swamp.
And so how do you deal with this then? I mean, what's the solution? Can Congress fix this problem? And do you think there's political will, maybe not in Congress, but among the electorate at least?
Well, here's the good news. Within the Republican conference, there may be only 25 or 30 who are evil or complete sellouts. And there are 25 or 30 who will do the right thing even when nobody's watching. Like, they have deep convictions and they completely believe in what they campaigned on and are willing to follow through. The rest of the conference, the GOP conference, you see there's about 240 of us right now, pre-election. That may go down after November. But the rest of the conference, which is about 180 Republicans, will go along with whoever has prevailed to grab control of leadership. And unfortunately, it's the 25 or 30 who sell out the quickest or are the least convicted in what they believe that are in leadership now. If we could change the leadership of the majority party, and hopefully Republicans will still be in the majority, if we could change the leadership such that one of those 25 to 30 who are, you know, deeply believe what they campaign in and deeply care about the country and the Constitution could go into leadership, then I believe that the 180 who are, I mean, they're conflicted. I don't blame them for the choices they make. They may believe that going along with the current leadership is the best way to serve their constituents, and so they have to make those choices. But they wouldn't be put in a tough spot if the leadership actually believed in what they campaigned on and what we all campaign on, which is smaller government. So that's my hope. That's the bright spot here, is that we've got a chance, if we keep the majority, to take the leadership by electing somebody like, for instance, Jim Jordan as Speaker of the House.
And so what can an average American, you know, I saw the polls not too long ago, 74% of Americans are concerned about the deep state. So what does an average person sitting at home watching this do to help drain the deep swamp?
Well, you know, with the Freedom Index, your scorecard, you help the average American track votes. I think there are like 20 votes every year or every 6 months that you focus in on. The American people need to focus in on the leadership vote. The first vote that every member of Congress will take on January 3rd, 2019 is the vote for Speaker of the House. So the American people can go to their congressman and say, who are you going to vote for Speaker of the House and why? And if their congressman says, well, I think this guy's going to win and that's why I'm going to vote for him because I think he can win, then they need to get a new congressman.
Okay, good, very good. And so, you know, unfortunately, even though the Republicans typically do better on the Freedom Index, you know, the constitutionality of their voting record than the Democratic Party, there's still a lot of Republicans out there who have, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s. How do Americans who want the Constitution enforced get their congressman to pay attention? I mean, do you have any strategies or tactics for an American who wants their congressman to vote according to the Constitution? How do we get the Republican Party as a whole more serious about the Constitution also?
The people have to be engaged in primaries. In my congressional district, I represent 750,000 people, which is the size of every congressional district on average. It's about 750,000 people. In a Republican primary, there will only be 60 to 90,000 people voting. So 10% or less of the electorate is going to decide who wins that primary. So your vote is 10 times as effective or consequential in a primary, particularly if you're in a red congressional district. You need to get engaged. You need to play in the primaries, support congressmen who are constitutional. If you got one who ran on constitutionality and he's up there, you know, voting against the Constitution, if he has a 50 on the Freedom Index, you need to get him out of there. You need to back his opponent. Mm-hmm. And I'm not advocating for any particular candidate. I'm advocating for the Constitution here.
Speaking of the Constitution, you know, there's an ongoing debate, I'm sure you've seen some of it, on how do we get back to the Constitution, how do we rein in the out-of-control federal government. I think there's widespread agreement among Americans that the government's out of control. And there's one school of thought that says we ought to change the Constitution to get the government under control, maybe have an Article 5 convention. And then there's the other school of thought, well, why don't we just enforce it? Do you have any thoughts on which one of those options might be better?
Well, I'm not for a constitutional convention, and let me tell you why. First of all, as you mentioned, my colleagues don't follow the Constitution we have. What makes people think they would follow a new one? Second of all, since the Bill of Rights and the 11th Amendment, I can't think of a single amendment to the Constitution that has limited the size and scope of government, of the federal government. Mm-hmm. In fact, they've except for the repeal of an amendment, the repeal of prohibition, mm-hmm. that's the only exception. And for the most part, they expand the role of federal government when you go to amend it. This is not the right political environment to do that. Finally, there are people who are going to game the amendments. For instance, 4 days after we passed a horrible omnibus bill in March, my colleagues put on the floor a bill to put a constitutional amendment to our Constitution that would require a balanced budget. Okay, sounds good. You poll balanced budget amendment, that's going to be 90%, 85%. Here's the problem. First of all, the amendment said, this amendment doesn't apply in times of war. Okay, well, we've been at war in Afghanistan for 17 years. So basically that wouldn't apply for the last 17 years. That's problematic. And if we didn't have a war, I told you, you know, the first vote we take is for Speaker of the House. The second vote would be to declare war every Congress so that the balanced budget amendment wouldn't apply. Finally, the other problem with this balanced budget amendment, it said, you know, it had sort of this safety fuse in it that said, well, if there's something so important that we need to bust the budget, then 60% of Congress should be the threshold for getting rid of the balanced budget. I went back and looked at the omnibus we passed 4 days before we voted on this balanced budget amendment. 61% of Congress voted for that horrible omnibus. And the one we just voted for about 10 days ago in the House of Representatives, the omnibus there, it got 75% of Republicans and 95% of Democrats. So you tell me how a balanced budget amendment that lets 60% of Congress break it is going to stop us from what we're doing right now. It won't. So that's sort of some of the reasons that I'm concerned. Also in a constitutional convention, the types of people that are rising to the top right now in elections are going to, those are basically elections. You know, there's going to be a process that determines who gets to write that new that new amendment or the amendments to the Constitution and who gets to vote on those, and the same sort of political hacks that have risen to the top in our leadership right now are going to rise to the top, and you're going to get more government, not less.
And that reminds me, I have another question about that. You have a bill about the education department that would wind down the education department. Why should we wind down the education department?
Oh, wow. How much time do you have? Okay. So first of all, the Department of Education was established by Jimmy Carter as a re-election tactic, as a ploy. And it's been part of Ronald Reagan's platform and the Republican platform to eliminate the Department of Education. But I saw an opportunity to reintroduce this notion, and as a bill, when everybody got upset about Betsy DeVos's confirmation. That was the last controversial confirmation, was the Secretary of Education, because the left understands this is where you win or lose, is in the schools and in the teaching of the children. So I got a lot of phone calls from constituents and frankly liberals all over the country who wanted me to vote against Betsy DeVos. Well, there's only one problem with that. I'm in the House, I'm not in the Senate. So the Senate has the power of advice and consent according to the Constitution. So my staff would tell the callers, and there were lots of callers, he doesn't get to vote on that. Well, the callers would insist that I was passing the buck, that there was something I could do, and that I must do something. So I wrote a one-page bill, and it says, the Department of Education shall terminate on December 31st, 2018. And I introduced that the day they were voting on her confirmation. That was my effort that they asked of me. And so then when the callers ask, what are you doing to stop Betsy DeVos? We say now, well, we're trying to eliminate the department and thus eliminate her job. She would no longer be employed by the Department of Education. It wouldn't exist. And some of them get upset at that notion, and then I ask the liberals who want the federal government involved, I say, do you really want President Trump deciding what or how your children learn? And so now you've got a situation where the left has to advocate for President Trump controlling their child's education if they want to keep the Department of Education.
That's brilliant. So anything else you want to add before we finish here?
Recently, there's been the hearings about the Kavanaugh confirmation, and I've been really disappointed in the media and the American people for focusing solely on that, because a lot of bad stuff's happened in the House while everybody was distracted by that. So, for instance, I mentioned not the balanced budget amendment, but the unbalanced budget passed, the cromnibus, if you will. That passed while nobody was watching, and passed the Senate as well. So all of these people who are being lauded for their Kavanaugh vote, almost every single one of them, particularly the ones who have become heroes now for their Kavanaugh vote, voted for this unbalanced budget, voted to leverage our future and mortgage our grandchildren's country. Okay, so that's something I want to talk about. And also there was an expansion of the Patriot Act that happened while nobody was watching, that will allow the federal government, nonprofit institutions, and banks to share your financial information without a warrant. All in the name of stopping sex trafficking. They put the name on the bill just weeks before the election, so that it makes it hard for even the constitutionalists to vote against a bill, because they know there's going to be an ad running in their district saying they support sex trafficking if they don't vote for this bill. But in fact, the bill it's got a great name, but I had to vote against the bill, and several other constitutionalists did vote against the bill at our own peril. Okay, but there were constitutionalists who voted for the bill because they felt like they would endanger their election. But all of that happened while America was watching the Kavanaugh hearings. So don't get distracted would be another piece of advice I have. Keep a close eye on your member of Congress, regardless of what's in the news. Look for alternate sources of information, like the New American, that don't get distracted. And that's how we make things better. We've got to close that feedback loop so that people really know what's going on inside the swamp.
Wonderful. Congressman Massie, thank you so much.
Thank you.